There is something that happens in the moment you go quiet. Not the silence of having nothing to say. The silence of choosing not to engage. The silence of withdrawing your reaction, your explanation, your emotional participation from someone who has been surviving on exactly those things. And in that moment, something shifts. The person who seems so confident, so in control, so certain of their position, begins to unravel in a way that surprises everyone in the room, including you. Most people assume that silence is passive, that it is the absence of power rather than a form of it. But what psychology has discovered, what philosophers have understood for centuries, and what toxic people know on a level they would never consciously admit, is that your silence is not empty. It is one of the most psychologically charged things a human being can produce. And for a very specific type of person, your silence is not just uncomfortable, it is genuinely terrifying. Before we go any further, there is something important to understand. This is not a story about revenge. This is not a strategy for winning arguments or making people feel small. This is a story about what silence actually is at a psychological level, why it carries the power it does, and why the people most threatened by it are almost always the people who have been using your voice, your reaction, your emotional participation as the invisible architecture of their own psychological stability. And once you understand this, something changes in you permanently. But to understand why toxic people fear your silence, we first need to understand what they have been living on all along. Picture a relationship that confuses you. Someone in your life who seems to need constant engagement, constant reaction, constant evidence that you are affected by what they do and say. When you respond with emotion, whether frustration, guilt, defensiveness, or pain, they seem satisfied in some way you cannot quite name. Not happy, exactly, but settled, stabilized, as if your emotional response confirms something they needed to believe. And when you do not respond, when you go quiet, something in them fractures. They escalate. They push harder. They say something more extreme, more hurtful, more designed to provoke. Not because they are winning, because they are panicking. This pattern has a name, and understanding it requires going deeper than most conversations about toxic behavior ever go. Alfred Adler, the psychologist who broke from Freud to develop his own framework of human motivation, argued that beneath most difficult human behavior is a single driving force: the need to feel significant, not loved necessarily, not even liked, significant. The need to matter in the experience of another person. Adler believed that when healthy pathways to significance are unavailable or undeveloped, people find other pathways. And one of the most reliable, most addictive, and most destructive pathways to feeling significant is the ability to generate emotional responses in another person, specifically distress. This is the mechanism most people miss entirely. For a certain type of person, your pain is proof of their power. Your anger is evidence of their impact. Your guilt is confirmation that they matter enough to affect you. And your silence, complete and genuine silence, strips away all of that confirmation in a single moment. Something even more important is happening beneath this surface level. And it changes the way you understand every difficult relationship you have ever been in. The toxically behaving person is not, at their core, powerful. Adler would argue they are precisely the opposite. The relentless pursuit of dominance through other people's emotional reactions is not the behavior of someone who feels secure. It is the behavior of someone who feels profoundly insignificant in their own internal experience and has built an entire psychological survival system around extracting confirmation of their significance from the world outside themselves, which means they are completely dependent on that world responding the way they need it to. Your reaction is not just satisfying to them. It is structurally necessary. It is how the architecture stays standing. Carl Jung described the part of the psyche responsible for this dynamic as the shadow, not in a mystical sense, but in a deeply practical, psychological one. Jung understood that the aspects of ourselves we cannot face, cannot integrate, cannot acknowledge, do not disappear. They go underground. They operate beneath the surface of conscious awareness, driving behavior in ways the person doing the behaving may never fully recognize. The toxic person who cannot tolerate your silence is not consciously aware that your silence is exposing the emptiness at the center of their psychological identity. They simply experience your silence as an attack, as abandonment, as a threat so fundamental that the response it produces seems wildly disproportionate to what actually happened. And this is where the psychology becomes genuinely uncomfortable, not just for the toxic person, but for you. Think about the last time someone went quiet on you. Not cold, not hostile, just genuinely, calmly disengaged. Notice what happened in your body. Even if the relationship was healthy, even if nothing was particularly wrong, there is a primal response to the withdrawal of another person's engagement that activates something ancient in the human nervous system. Neuroscience has identified what happens in the brain during social exclusion, and it is not subtle. The same neural pathways that process physical pain, processed social rejection. Being ignored activates the brain's threat response in ways that are measurable, physiological, and immediate. This evolutionary. For most of human history, being cut off from the group was not merely unpleasant. It was a death sentence. The nervous system learned to treat social disconnection as an emergency. And that ancient wiring is still running in every human brain on Earth, including yours, including the toxic person's. And this is the key, including it far more intensely in people whose early experiences taught them that the withdrawal of attention or engagement meant something catastrophic about their worth as a person. Most people's relationship with silence was shaped long before they understood what was happening to them. Imagine a child who grew up in a home where love was conditional, where attention was unpredictable, where emotional safety depended on reading the moods of the adults around them correctly and performing accordingly. That child learns something very specific and very durable, that other people's emotional engagement is not just pleasant, It is survival. The withdrawal of it is not just painful. It is annihilation. And when that child grows into an adult who has never done the work of examining and healing those early patterns, they carry that primal equation with them into every relationship. Your attention equals their existence. Your silence equals their disappearance. Viktor Frankl wrote about the human need for meaning, arguing that even more than pleasure or power, what people are fundamentally searching for is a sense that their existence matters. When healthy sources of meaning are available, people pursue them. When they are not, people will find meaning wherever they can, including in the ability to provoke, destabilize, and control the emotional states of the people closest to them. The toxic person has often, without knowing it, made your reaction the central source of evidence that their existence is meaningful, which is why the removal of that reaction does not feel to them like a social adjustment. It feels like an existential threat. But here is where the understanding deepens into something that most people in these conversations never reach. And this is the part that changes everything. The power of your silence is not that it punishes. It is that it reveals. When you remove your emotional participation from a dynamic that has been built on it, what gets exposed is the reality that was always underneath. The insecurity that was always there. The emptiness that was being filled by your reactions. The fragility that was being mistaken for strength. Your silence does not create these things. It simply makes them visible. And for a person who has been managing their entire psychological world around keeping these things invisible, your silence is not a withdrawal of care. It is a mirror they did not ask to look into. Marcus Aurelius, in the Meditations, returned again and again to a single idea: that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, and that our power lies entirely in our response to what happens rather than in the events themselves. The Stoics understood something about silence that modern psychology is only now quantifying: that the ability to withhold your reaction, to create space between stimulus and response, is not merely a social strategy. It is a form of complete sovereignty over the only domain you actually control. And sovereign people are the most threatening people that a person who requires external confirmation of their worth will ever encounter. Epictetus, who spent his early life as a slave, understood this more viscerally than almost any philosopher in history. He wrote that no one can hurt you without your consent, not in the naive sense that pain is not real, but in the deeply practical sense that the person who can take away your inner calm has more power over you than chains ever could. The person who cannot take it has no real power at all. Your silence is the demonstration, visible and unmistakable, that you have reclaimed that inner territory. And for someone who has built their sense of power on the ability to destabilize you, that demonstration is devastating. Something even more dangerous is happening beneath the surface of this dynamic. And most people in these relationships never see it clearly. Watch closely. What happens when you first begin to practice genuine silence in a relationship with a toxic person? The initial response is almost always escalation. They push harder. They make more dramatic claims. They become more extreme in their behavior. And this, counterintuitively, is evidence that the silence is working. Because what is happening is not aggression, though it looks like aggression. What is happening is desperation. The system that has been regulating their psychological equilibrium is failing, and they are trying to restart it by increasing the voltage. The fact that they escalate is not a sign that you should engage. It is a sign that you should hold the silence even more completely. What comes after the escalation, if you hold, is one of two things. Either the person does something entirely unexpected. They stop. They become reflective, sometimes for the first time. They begin to encounter themselves without the buffer of your reaction, and something in them, however painful, begins to shift toward genuine self-awareness. Or they leave. They find someone else whose reactions are more available, whose emotional responses are more accessible, whose presence can be used to maintain the architecture that your silence has made uninhabitable. And either outcome, though one is clearly preferable, is a resolution. Both are better than the alternative of continuing to provide your reactions as the invisible foundation of someone else's psychological survival. This is where the philosophy of the matter becomes deeply personal, and where the real work begins. Seneca wrote that we should retreat into ourselves as much as we can, and receive in the company of those who will make us better. Such men as we ourselves are capable of making better. He was describing something that goes beyond social selectivity. He was describing the responsibility each person has to maintain the quality of their own inner environment. Because the truth that most people in difficult relationships discover too late is that it is not just the toxic person who becomes dependent on the dynamic. Over time, the person providing the reactions begins to organize their own psychological world around the relationship as well. The hypervigilance, the constant emotional processing, the endless analysis of what happened and what it meant and what to do next. This too is a form of addiction, a more sympathetic one, but an addiction nonetheless. Your silence, practiced genuinely and not as a weapon but as an act of reclamation, begins to break both dependencies simultaneously. Theirs to your reaction, yours to the relationship as the central drama of your psychological life. And in the space that opens up, something begins to grow that was not possible before. A relationship with your own interior world that does not require external confirmation to feel real. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are, rather than who you have been shaped to perform being. It does not happen in dramatic moments. It happens in the quiet ones, in the moments where you could have reacted and chose not to. In the moments where the old pull toward engagement was there and you noticed it, acknowledged it, and let it pass without following it. Each one of those moments is a small but genuine act of becoming, and they accumulate into something that the person you were at the beginning of these dynamics could not have imagined. There is a final layer to this that almost no one discusses, and it is perhaps the most important thing in this entire exploration. The fear that toxic people have of your silence is not entirely about power. Though power is part of it, it is not entirely about significance, though significance is central to it. At the deepest level, the fear is about encountering themselves without an intermediary, without your reactions to define them, without your emotional responses to confirm their impact, without your guilt or anger or pain to fill the space between who they have told themselves they are and who they actually are. They are left with something they have been running from, often for their entire lives: themselves. The unmediated, unconfirmed, unperformed self that exists beneath all the behavior, beneath all the manipulation, beneath all the need for control. And that self is frightening precisely because it has never been faced, never been accepted, never been integrated into a coherent sense of identity that does not depend on other people's reactions to sustain it. This is not said to generate sympathy, though perhaps it deserves some. It is said because understanding this changes something in the person who has been providing the reactions. When you see that the toxic person's fear of your silence is ultimately a fear of their own emptiness, it becomes harder to take their behavior personally. Not impossible, not painless, but harder. And in that subtle shift of perspective, the hold they have had on your emotional world begins to loosen in a way that no amount of argument or confrontation ever achieved. Your silence was never nothing. It was always everything. The question was only whether you understood what you were holding, and whether you had the self-knowledge and the courage. Clamation, it has always been capable of becoming not for them, for you, for the version of yourself that exists when no one is performing for anyone, when the reactions are no longer currency, when the silence is not a weapon or a withdrawal, but simply the natural state of a person who has returned, finally and completely, to themselves. Here is the question that matters, the one worth sitting with long after this video ends. If the people in your life were no longer able to access your emotional reactions, if your silence became complete and genuine and sustained, who in your world would still be there? And what does that answer tell you about every relationship you are currently maintaining at the cost of your own peace? If this kind of psychology resonates with you, the kind that goes beneath the surface and changes how you see yourself and the people around you, consider subscribing. This channel exists for the people who are not satisfied with easy answers to complicated questions. And there is much more coming.